In this series so far, we've seen Mario go through many changes. Before the release of Super Mario Bros., he was just a humble plumber, or carpenter maybe, with a dinky little jump that he used to rescue helpless damsels from giant urban-dwelling apes and lay the smackdown on seemingly endless infestations of sewer turtles and crabs. But by the point we've reached, Mario was a kind of fantasy hero with animal-inspired superpowers, flying through the air on the back of a talking dinosaur and using a magic flower to hurl fireballs at wizards. The development of Mario into a character not all that different from the one we know today happened over the span of just 5 years, during most of which Nintendo faced relatively little competition in the home console market, both at home and overseas, particularly compared to how crowded the American market had been a few years earlier, during the early 1980s. But the days of Nintendo's uncontested glory were numbered. Now that demand for video games had revived, there were opportunities aplenty to satisfy that demand in ways that Nintendo hadn't bothered to. And with computer technology becoming cheaper and easier to use every day, the barriers to entry for the video game software market were phenomenally low. Even the hardware side was accessible enough to tempt companies with no experience in making video games to dip a toe in the water, like Viewmaster. You know, the people who made that red goggle thing with the discs that let you see photos in 3D? Yeah, they made a video game console in 1989 called the Viewmaster Interactive Vision, which used VHS tapes and a controller designed by space aliens to play games that are, let's be honest, about as engaging as the average Atari 2600 game. Now that was not a particularly successful product, but other home consoles were, like Hudson Soft's PC Engine, later known as the TurboGrafx 16 in the US. This was a cutting-edge 16-bit console that released substantially ahead of Nintendo's Super Famicom, and it captured a respectable share of the Japanese market before Nintendo could even get out of the gate. The good news for Nintendo is that Hudson failed to develop a strong foothold in America and Europe. The bad news was that this was due less to Nintendo's dominance and more to their being butted out by another rival that already had a foothold there, Sega. Previous pretenders to the console throne had often faltered at the last and most crucial step of the process, securing a large and diverse library of fun games to play on whatever home console it was you were selling. Shortcomings in this area were what had limited the success of the PC Engine, and would ultimately doom its 32-bit successor, the Japan-exclusive PCFX, to failure. But Sega was different. Their home console venture in the mid-80s, the Master System, grew out of their experience in the arcade market, where variety was king. Moving second in the 8-bit console generation had given them the opportunity to observe Nintendo's successes and learn from them, so they knew that anyone who wanted to take market share from the Big N would need a killer library to do it. Nintendo was in a position to make this quite difficult for them, since it had shrewdly locked up most third-party developers in exclusive licensing deals, preventing them from working with any other console manufacturer. Sega's response to this was similar to what Nintendo had done in the earliest years of the Famicom, and would later be forced to do again when the Sony PlayStation drained third-party support away from the N64. Grit your teeth and learn to do everything yourself. With only a handful of third-party supporters, Sega managed to give its Master System a comprehensive library of genre titles. It had shooters, platformers, fighting games, racing games, sports games, puzzle games, RPGs, all developed in-house to a mostly high standard of quality. These games weren't all as good as their NES counterparts, but they were good enough, especially in markets that Nintendo wasn't currently serving. The result was a console that lost to the NES in developed markets, but turned the tables in emerging ones, and almost drew even in the United States, a wild card that couldn't be said to favor any one console manufacturer by the end of the 1980s. And this was when Sega struck, and struck hard. In mid-1989, while Nintendo was still planning the launch of the Super Famicom in Japan, Sega unveiled a rebranded version of its Mega Drive in the US, the newly christened Sega Genesis. Once again, moving second had put Sega in an almost ideal position. Hudson had gone out onto the bleeding edge with the TurboGrafx 16, and suffered for it, because software developers hadn't adjusted to working with the new hardware yet. Meanwhile, Nintendo had been caught off guard, left behind in the 8-bit backwater, while Sega stormed ahead to take advantage of those 16 beautiful bits of processing power. Sega was still banging on all cylinders when it came to making games in-house, but now third-party studios were beginning to drift to their side as well. Those exclusive licensing deals don't last forever, and major developers like Electronic Arts and Namco wanted to be in on the next big thing. While Sega wasn't able to make many exclusive deals of its own, Nintendo's third-party stranglehold had been broken, and throughout the 16-bit era, the standard for big third-party hits would be a release on both consoles, often simultaneously. But it wasn't enough for Sega to change the rules of the game on Nintendo so suddenly and decisively. Oh no. They had to add insult to injury, with a marketing campaign that directly called Nintendo out as stodgy and stuck in the past. And the pièce de résistance of this advertising assault was their new mascot, selected to be the antithesis of Nintendo's beloved Mario in just about every conceivable way: Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was so early 90s it hurt, and being so much something that it hurt was a very early 90s thing to do. It was an age of excess, not just in terms of style, but also in terms of personality. Sega successfully portrayed the earlier video game icon Mario as a bit of a bore, frumpy, slow, stoic, and unexcitable. Sonic was pitched as his exact opposite: young, impatient, and edgy, with bucket loads of that evasive but highly sought-after 90s commodity known as attitude. Mario was just some guy. Sonic was an animal, but a cool one, with sneakers and spiky hair. Even the color of their sprites marked them as opposites. Sonic with his unruly shock of electric blue fur, and Mario with... okay, Mario has a lot of blue on his sprite as well, but we all know that his accent color is red. Also, let's be frank, the idea that Mario is a slow character is pretty fallacious to begin with. Just because his identity isn't tied up in being fast doesn't mean that the pace of Mario games isn't fast. It is. But hey, this is marketing. It doesn't have to be honest to be effective. When it comes to Sega's brand strategy, though, Sonic the Hedgehog is an honest reflection of their attitude. Maybe a little too upfront, actually. Since they couldn't reasonably claim to have all the best games on their own system, they shifted the goalposts and said that they had the coolest games. Our sound chip doesn't sound as natural as the Super Nintendo's? Whoever said that was our intention? The point of our sound chip is to sound cool, with shredding electronic synths and a stronger emphasis on drums and bass. And in terms of processing power, just raw speed in rendering pixels on screen, the Genesis was legitimately a more powerful console than the Super Nintendo. The Sonic series showed off all of these differences to stunning effect, and made full use of the console's capabilities. So it really was for Sega what the Mario series was for Nintendo, a pathbreaker, and a mark of quality that set a high bar for other games to pursue. And this strategy worked. That was the main thing. The original Sonic the Hedgehog didn't spike the American launch of the Super Nintendo, as it was probably meant to, since it came out exactly 1 month before the launch, but it massively boosted sales of the Genesis, and on top of that managed to outsell Super Mario World over the holiday season. This was not just a slap in the face to Nintendo. The Genesis does what Nintendo campaign was already that. This was a punch to the solar plexus. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and the console wars were on. So what would be Nintendo's first move, you may ask? Well, curious as it seems, Nintendo responded to this marketing onslaught by doing nothing. Not with Mario, or over the next 4 years anyway. It seems like Nintendo's management intuitively understood that the Genesis had an inherently stronger affinity with a certain type of gamer and certain types of games, particularly in arcadey genres like racing games, beat-em-ups, and shooters, as well as licensed sports games, which had never been a strong suit for Nintendo. Rather than competing directly with Sega on this front, Nintendo went in a different direction entirely. That's not to say that the Super Nintendo had no games of a more action-oriented or adult nature. It's just that Nintendo mostly left that to third-party developers, who often ported these games to the Genesis at the same time. Mortal Kombat 2, for instance, was a bestseller on the SNES, but it sold more copies on the Genesis. It wasn't until 1994, with the release of Nintendo R&D1's Super Metroid and Rare's Donkey Kong Country, that Nintendo's exclusive releases began to target the same market as Sega's, and that was just a year or two before the end of the 16-bit console generation. Not only that, but between 1990 and 1995, Nintendo EAD more or less abandoned the mainline Mario series, which had been tainted by comparisons with Sonic, and focused instead on spin-offs that would bring the Mario magic to a variety of different genres, and which, perhaps more importantly, Sega wasn't in a position to immediately one-up. Not that they didn't try. Mario was no stranger to spin-offs before this, of course. In addition to the endless barrage of Mario-branded merch that flooded Kmarts across the world, there had been a Mario animated movie in 1986, 3 seasons of Saturday morning cartoons in the late 80s, and a dozen or so very unusual software products, some of which only barely qualify as games. But up to this point, most Mario spin-offs were of the familiar take a generic product and slap a brand on it school. Most of these games were not made by Nintendo, and honestly didn't have much to recommend them. Heck, that goes for some of the ones that were made by Nintendo. Most of these spin-offs were puzzle games of some kind. Yoshi, for instance, had his mug plastered on 3 puzzle games during this period. Yoshi in 1991, a Tetris variant that got mixed reviews and in retrospect is pretty dull, Yoshi's Cookie, a tile-matching game that got mixed reviews and in retrospect was done a lot better in Mario & Luigi, although the soundtrack is pretty kickin', and Tetris Attack, which is highly addictive, but still not as good as Kirby's Avalanche, which is actually the same game as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, by the way. There was also Yoshi's Safari, Nintendo's only Mario-branded game for the ill-fated Super Scope accessory, in which Mario rides Yoshi around a new kingdom known as Jewelry Land, shooting the bejesus out of damn near everything, including the Koopalings riding around inside giant mech suits shaped like their heads. To be honest, this game has a lot of charm, and the stylish presentation goes some way toward making up for the boring gameplay, but in terms of Mario series legacy, it's got nothing. The same is true for the earlier spin-offs not starring Yoshi, like the educational games Mario is Missing and Mario's Time Machine, both of which are just fairly basic Carmen Sandiego ripoffs, with a very light dusting of Mario iconography, made by the same studio that put out Bebe's Kids. I personally don't think anyone responsible for Bebe's Kids should have been allowed to work on another video game ever again, but they did eventually create The Simpsons Hit and Run, so I guess things worked out. There's the truly horrendous Hotel Mario for the Philips CDI, which did nothing for Mario's image or to combat cheap Italian stereotypes, though I admit that comedy on YouTube wouldn't be the same without it. We also have Mario's Picross, which is a pretty good puzzle game. It's just that it has absolutely nothing to do with Mario. To even come close, they have to make him an archaeologist in this one, which is a very, wait, what? Kind of decision. Mario isn't Barbie. You can't just give him any occupation and expect it to work. Dr. Mario is a little more believable, because with all the time that he spends down in the sewers, I get that Mario would want to learn everything he could about infectious diseases. And while the gameplay here still has nothing to do with Mario's core competencies, it was a good enough concept to at least earn it a few ports to the Game Boy and N64. Despite getting off to a bad start, as the 90s went on, Mario spin-offs got better, and each one began to feel more like a Mario take on its genre, rather than a generic take on it pasted over with Mario-themed stickers. Mario Teaches Typing, for instance, may have been just a typing tutor, but at least it tried to make the gameplay look like a Mario stage. Not that it really worked. And the CD version from 1995 even featured a friendly, albeit terrifying, animated Mario head, saying his not-yet-iconic phrase, "It's-a-me," for the first time. The voice for this bizarre Bonzi Buddy version of Mario was provided by a little-known voice actor named Charles Martinet, who would go on to be the official voice of Mario in every major game in the series, until he was replaced by Kevin Afghani in 2023. Mario Paint from 1992 barely counts as a game, though it does contain the infamous minigame Gnat Attack, but it's absolutely dripping with Mario style. This is also the game that introduced the concept of letting players appropriate and combine art assets from previous Mario games to build their own artistic creations, a clear precursor to the approach taken later by the super popular Mario Maker series. And the 1994 Game Boy game Donkey Kong, for once actually made by Nintendo EAD, didn't necessarily add a lot to the lore or enemy roster of Mario. The game's design doesn't emphasize enemies much in any case. But it did give Mario some acrobatic new moves, including several jumps that must have had an influence on the triple jumping, kicking, and diving that would prove so crucial to the design of Super Mario 64. So that leaves us with just 3 spin-offs from Mario's first decade that had a major influence on the series as a whole. Super Mario Land in 1989, Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins in 1992, and Super Mario Kart, also in 1992. Super Mario Land is the least influential of the 3, and also the weirdest, due in no small part to the fact that Shigeru Miyamoto barely had anything to do with it. As a launch title for the Game Boy, it faced development restrictions more severe than anything Nintendo had developed since the Game & Watch series, so naturally the project was entrusted to a team that knew exactly what they were in for technology-wise. In other words, the people who made the Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi's team at Nintendo R&D 1. These were not artsy-fartsy people like Takashi Tezuka or Shigefumi Hino. They were tech heads, whose aesthetic muse led them to some very gritty and grotesque places. Their biggest software successes up to this point had been Kid Icarus and Metroid. This was an unusual studio to leave Mario with, and true to form, they delivered a really unusual Mario game. At first glance, it looks like the original Super Mario Bros. Mario's sprite checks out, the Goombas and everything, but then you see pyramids? And sphinxes? So this is Egypt, like real-life Egypt. Huh. Then you start to notice other things. Jump on a Koopa, and instead of disappearing or leaving a shell, it turns into a bomb and blows up in your face. Eat a fire flower and you no longer shoot out fireballs, but instead a single super ball-like thing that ricochets around the room picking up coins. Instead of the normal invincibility music, a star now plays you a little 8-bit rendition of the Can-Can from Jacques Offenbach's Orpheus in the Underworld. And that's not the only musical oddity here. In the original Super Mario Bros., the underground music was smooth and jazzy, with an instantly catchy hook. Da-da-da-da-da-da. But in Super Mario Land, take a pipe underground and what you hear is big fat dopey tuba music, like you'd hear in a cartoon. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. In a world with only Donkey Kong and the arcade Mario Brothers to go by, Super Mario Land would have fit right in, and even been considered a major improvement. If it had followed Super Mario Bros., it would be seen as a weird and inferior portable version of a classic, but still a worthy addition to the series. Instead, this game came out a year or two after Super Mario Bros. 3, so if you were an early adopter of the Game Boy, you got to witness the spectacle of going straight from maybe the most polished Mario game ever to a game so unpolished that if you left it on top of a pile of rocks, it would blend right in and you might never see it again. So if this is such a dead end in terms of Mario design, you might wonder why I called it a major spin-off earlier. Well, there's two reasons for that. One is that it brought a few concepts to the Mario series that would later recur not so much in the main series as in other spin-offs, particularly the character Princess Daisy, who went on to be a major rival to Princess Peach and something of a fan favorite. Despite Mario being the one to rescue her originally, later on Nintendo would establish her as a love interest for Luigi, in their continuing quest to give Luigi one of everything that Mario has until his dark, gnawing feelings of inadequacy are quenched. Another of these ideas is the World Tour aspect of the game's overall structure. Every kingdom in Super Mario Land is based on a real-world equivalent. The Birabido Kingdom on ancient Egypt, the Muda Kingdom on Bermuda, the Easton Kingdom on Easter Island, and the Chai Kingdom on ancient China. And yes, I know Chai means tea, I'm just being facetious here. Super Mario games up to this point had been set in fantasy worlds, far removed from any real-world inspiration, and this trend would continue for many years. But later games in the series would have more of a world-hopping feel. Super Mario Sunshine's Isle Delfino, in particular, is strongly inspired by tourist destinations in Italy, and Super Mario Odyssey featured several worlds based heavily on real places, especially Toast Arena, which is clearly Mexican-themed, and New Donk City, which is supposed to look like Manhattan. While this isn't a whole lot in legacy terms, Super Mario Land had one other way of influencing the series, which is that despite its overt wackiness, it sold incredibly well, paving the way for a secondary series that would parallel the development of its older and more polished brethren. Within 3 years of this game's release, it had a sequel, which would refine some of its coarser aspects and add lots of new innovations, resulting in an experience that I consider the equal of any entry from the original NES trilogy, though it's unquestionably very different. Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, released in late 1992, just about a year after the launch of the Super Nintendo in America. It was pitched in magazines and advertisements as Nintendo's big traditional platformer release for the 1992 holiday season, occupying the same spot as Super Mario World from the year before. In 1993, the big-ticket attraction was Super Mario All-Stars, a compilation of the first 3 Super Mario games, plus the Lost Levels, that is, the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, reworked with more elaborate graphics and music. And in 1994, they just kind of stopped caring. I'm kidding, of course. 1994 was the year Donkey Kong Country came out. Nintendo didn't need to make any platformers that holiday season. Rare had them covered. 6 Golden Coins benefited hugely from the 3 years of design advances that had occurred since the launch of the Game Boy, leapfrogging from a stripped-down version of Super Mario Bros. To something more like a stripped-down Super Mario World. Like that game, this one features a generally more open-world map full of shortcuts and little secrets to find. Also like Super Mario World, this game allows you to save your progress, making it much easier to pick up even when you don't have much time on your hands. Here, the problem of the Game Boy's tiny screen size is solved not by making everything small, but by zooming the camera in, meaning that each sprite takes up a lot more space on screen. But the level design is also denser to compensate for this, with fewer bottomless pits and platforms spaced closer together. Along with a few mechanical tweaks, this makes portable Mario control a lot more smoothly than he used to. The story is also simple, but innovative in its own way. It's been bandied about on the internet that the people at R&D 1 weren't huge fans of the Mario series, and jumped at the chance to subvert it with their own creation. Hiroji Kiyotake, one of the game's 2 directors, was particularly tired of the rescue the princess trope that had dominated the series since 1985, and he thought it would be fun for Mario to have his own personal motive for going on an adventure. So he basically gave Mario the ultimate man cave, a whole island full of cool stuff called Mario Land, and then wrote a story in which it would all be taken away by some evil jerk who brainwashes the island's inhabitants into serving him and throwing Mario out. But what would really make it personal is that this usurper wouldn't be some giant monster or a space alien. It would just be some guy who looked and acted a lot like Mario himself, but in all the wrong ways, a bizarro to Mario's Superman. And thus he was christened, combining the Japanese word for evil, Warui, with Mario's name, Wario. For all that I do consider Six Golden Coins to be a brilliantly designed game, its most enduring legacy has got to be the personality of its villain. Wario is a truly inspired creation, and one that could only come out of a team that didn't take Mario as seriously as his godfathers Miyamoto and Tezuka did. Because when you get right down to it, Wario is a very mean-spirited character. And I'm not talking about how he acts, I mean how he was designed. He's a parody of Mario, underlining how bizarre it is that an Italian plumber would become a fantasy hero in the first place. Both characters are short and fat, but Mario is stylized to the point where he looks like a stuffed animal, just kind of pudgy, while Wario is grossly fat and ugly. Both characters have a big nose and a mustache, but Mario's nose is often drawn as a smooth sphere. Wario's is like a big lumpy potato, and fittingly his mustache is shaped like a pair of crinkle-cut french fries. Wario has an emblem on his hat, again like Mario, but in his case it doesn't stay within the confines of the white circle, suggesting that it was sewed on wrong and he just didn't notice or care. Plus he has a huge face, with a permanent demented grin, although in fairness it should be pointed out that his pearly whites are immaculate, so I guess he at least brushes his teeth. In this game, anyway. There are a lot of memorable moments in Super Mario Land 2, but the final boss fight with Wario takes the cake. When it starts, he's sitting on a throne, your throne, and he tries to kill you by just bumping into you and butt-slamming the ground to make your own light fixtures fall down and crush you. Manage to hit him and he'll put his hands to his face, like, "Oh man, I didn't expect this to happen," and then go right back to body checking. In the second phase, he starts to use your own power-ups against you, an idea that would later, much later, be applied to Bowser. He floats around the room with the super carrot, trying to land on your head, while a statue of Mario in a pugilist stance looks on. Then he uses the fire flower and launches giant fireballs at you, and when you finally defeat him, he turns into this little imp. No longer able to overpower you, he sits down and weeps in self-pity, then throws his shoe at you in a fit of spite, sticks out his tongue, and jumps out the frickin' window. This whole experience was, and would remain for some time, the funniest thing that ever happened in a Mario game. It was an incredible debut for a character who was obviously too good to be left in obscurity, and from then on, Wario was a fixture in the Mario universe. Super Mario Land 3, as it turned out, would not star Mario at all, but would instead be a showcase for Wario, whose greed and crudity would be incorporated into a game where he acted as more of a mercenary anti-hero than an outright villain. It elaborated on the second game's idea of a more personal and selfish motivation for adventure. And while that's not palatable to every kind of customer, it was a refreshing alternative to the safe, bland heroism seen in the rest of the series. And in that regard, it has a lot in common with our final important spin-off. It's kind of funny that I dismissed the early Mario spin-offs as generic games with Mario branding before, because that's exactly what the mega-successful Super Mario Kart started off as. It was a simple attempt to make a multiplayer counterpart to the single-player-only F-Zero, a launch title for the SNES. The racers were just random guys in overalls who zipped around racetracks throwing down oil drums to mess up their opponents. It just so happened that the two directors assigned to the project, Tadashi Sugiyama and Hideki Kano, had more familiarity with Mario than they did with other racing games, and early on in development it occurred to them that Mario would be a good fit for the direction they intended to take the game. You see, there were a lot of problems associated with doing F-Zero but multiplayer. For one thing, 2 players demands a split screen to show the views of both racers, but F-Zero's long linear tracks couldn't be displayed this way. So they figured, why not make the tracks more compact, with lots of turns, so that each one would fit neatly inside a square map. That led them to the idea of using go-karts rather than super fast Formula 1 style cars, so the tight turns would make more sense. Another problem was that all the playable racers needed to be visually distinct, so players wouldn't mix themselves up with the other player. So who in the Nintendo catalog wears overalls, is a guy, and has a distinct visual look? Oh yeah, Mario. And by putting Mario in the cart, that offered the team plenty of characters to take the other spots. Luigi would look distinct because he's green. Princess Toadstool has long hair and wears a crown, and Toad has a funny hat. Yoshi is the same color as Luigi, but, He's a dinosaur, and as long as animals can ride go-karts, why not have Bowser as well? That would give them 6 racers, but just to round things out a bit, they threw in Donkey Kong Jr., no one is exactly sure why, and one of Bowser's minions, Koopa Troopa. And for those of you who are wondering why it's not a Goomba, Goombas don't have arms. Duh. So yeah, Super Mario Kart started off as a non-Mario project, but the idea of involving Mario came early enough in development to seep into the fabric of the game itself. This is arguably the first time that what you might call the Mario touch was applied to a game that wasn't a platformer. Lots of classic Mario stuff is recontextualized to work in a racing game. Instead of giving you extra lives, coins now speed you up, and if you peel out, you lose them. Mushrooms give you a sudden temporary surge of speed, and stars let you blow through obstacles and other razors. The oil cans from the original concept, which were one of the team's favorite ideas, turned into Donkey Kong Jr.'s bananas. And of course, it just wouldn't be Mario if you couldn't ruin somebody else's day by punting a green shell at them. Red shells add to the fun by homing in on the racer ahead of you, or you can toss a shell backward to discourage persistent tailgaters. But this wasn't just a game that successfully married Mario aesthetics with racing mechanics. It was a genuinely innovative racing game in its own right. How many racing games in 1992 had stages where you could destroy the borders of the track, or leave traps lying around to make things harder for your opponents in future laps? How many racing games sped up the music in the last lap, dramatizing the chaos that every Mario Kart match seemed to devolve into near the end? How many racing games had bottomless pits, or a friendly NPC who swooped down to tell you when you were going the wrong way? In the same way that the development of Super Mario Bros. In 1985 taught Nintendo a process for making great adventure games, this game's creation showed them how they could put a unique spin on other genres by adapting adventure game concepts to work in them. From Super Smash Bros. To Mario Party, future spin-offs in the series would follow the basic idea enshrined in the design of Super Mario Kart. Simple and easily learned mechanics, low skill floor, moderately high skill ceiling, outlandish style, and accessible fun trumping every other design consideration. And of all the many spin-offs Mario has been in, I think few are as beloved as the Mario Kart series. Over the years, its basic appeal has consistently been preserved and expanded on, with hardly a single misstep. The original Super Mario Kart was a massive hit, selling more than 8 million units, and yet Mario Kart 64 somehow managed to sell even more. In fact, apart from Double Dash on the GameCube, every Mario Kart game for home consoles has outsold the previous one. Mario Kart 8 is the best-selling Mario game period, with a staggering 76 million units sold. It's an incredible achievement for a series that started out with a bunch of pixelated fantasy characters bumping go-karts into each other in a field. Super Mario Kart's impact on the broader series is mostly limited to being the first game to have Bowser as a friendly, playable character, and introducing Lakitu as an assistant to Mario rather than an enemy, but its influence on the wide world of Mario spin-offs cannot be denied. By 1995, I would argue that Mario's classic era was definitively over, largely thanks to the unexpected blockbuster success of Mario spin-offs and other platformer series like Donkey Kong Country. Nintendo had made a bold attempt to translate the traditional Mario formula into a portable format with Super Mario Land 2, but the team responsible simply couldn't repress their desire to take it in a weirder direction. The result of that experiment wasn't more Mario, but instead the totally off-the-wall Wario Land series and its spin-offs, including one of my favorite Nintendo creations, the microgame-driven WarioWare series. With Rare and its Donkey Kong Country taking the pressure off Nintendo to compete directly with Sega, the company management ultimately decided not to bother. If Sonic the Hedgehog wanted to appear in a new game every year and take the platformer crown away from Mario, let him. Mario was moving on to bigger and better things. He had the whole world in front of him. So if we've left the classic era behind, where does that leave us now? Personally, I choose to refer to this next chapter in Mario's history, lasting roughly from the end of 1995 to the release of New Super Mario Bros. In mid-2006, as the experimental era. This is when the traditional Mario platformer was replaced by a plethora of side projects, all of which attempted to take Mario in different directions and see how far his brand identity could stretch. 1996's Super Mario 64 may seem pretty classic today, but at the time its approach was unprecedented. It too was an experiment, a successful one that managed to establish itself as the new Mario template. Super Mario Sunshine in 2002 was also highly experimental and made all kinds of weird changes, most of which didn't last. And in the meantime, what else was happening? Mario RPG, Mario board game, Mario fighting game, and Yoshi's baby platformer for babies. You had Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, Mario Baseball, Mario Pinball, Mario, but it's actually Donkey Kong again. There was so much Mario, but most of it was not the kind of Mario you'd expect if the last game you played was Super Mario World. I think that it's this period, more than any other, when Nintendo cemented its brand identity as being the alternative game company, the one that did its own thing, regardless of broader industry trends. Its designers and programmers had succeeded to the point that they were developing a considerable amount of clout, and going forward, it was their own crazy ideas that would determine how Nintendo's games turned out, more so than the dictates of management. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the game that kicked off Mario's experimental era, their first flagship console platformer in nearly half a decade. This was a Mario game in which you didn't play as Mario, Princess Peach was nowhere to be found, Bowser was a snot-nosed baby, and the damsel you went on an adventure to rescue was Luigi. It was called Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, and despite that straightforward name, it was one of the wildest rides any Mario player would ever experience.